Hello and welcome to the Local Foods Co-op training series on getting the best rich media from your mobile device. I'm your host, Wayne McPhail. This is part 3, and part 3 is all about composition, and composition is all about, particularly in terms of smartphones, all about getting a good picture in the field, in the moment, rather than having to crop it later to get a good effect. So let's dive right in. An important thing about composition is what you're trying to compose. And one way to think about photography in general, and certainly with a smartphone, is that you're filling blank rectangles with stories. You want to get the essence of what the story is about the photograph, whether it's a person or a landscape or an event. And one of the ways to do that is to see differently, to look at the world in different ways, in ways that help you compose the rectangle that you're taking a picture within. And one of the ways to do that is an old adage of photography is to look up, look down, look all around. To think about just not going to a scene and taking a single snapshot, but rather to imagine different ways. So, should I wait for another time? Should I shoot from above? Should I shoot at a different angle? Should I shoot through something? Because all those can render really different ways of generating a photograph that is compelling. So again, shoot from above, shoot from below, find a new scene, stop and see, rather than just sort of using it like using your phone like a snapshot camera. One of the photographers I really admire because she does tell great stories with her photographs and does compose well is Dorothea Lange. And you probably are familiar with some of her photographs. And she said something that's very true. The camera is an instrument that teaches people to see without a camera. And that's what I mean about thinking, seeing different, right? To look at the world as a composition, to look through the viewfinder or look through the back of your screen of your smartphone and compose your image rather than just shoot a picture. Here's another photographer I really like, Robert Capa, who had a wide-ranging photo career from being a war correspondent all the way to the fashion runways. And he said something that's also very true. If your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. One of the mistakes that photographers make, amateur photographers make, is that they're afraid to come close to a subject. And when I look at the photographs of students, what I do very often is say, if you just cropped in 15–20% on your image, it would be so much better. And what should really happen, especially with smartphones, because the sensors are so small, is that they should really move in. And we talked about last time, you don't want to zoom with your fingers, you want to zoom by stepping closer. And this is a similar kind of thing, that you really want to get close to the subject, and that means you have to step closer to them. Sometimes that's uncomfortable, but you have to get used to it because you're going to get a better picture. So here are some of Capa's photographs, and you can see that he gets really close to the subject, gets rid of what is not essential to the story, and gets some great images and composes some great images. Another great photographer who's great at composition and great at getting close to their subjects is Diane Arbus, and you may be familiar with her work. She really liked to photograph folks who were on the fringes of society. Here are some of her photographs, and you can really see how close she gets to the subject, how engaged she is with the subject. This is one of her most famous images, and we're going to come back to this one in a minute, but a very interesting photograph. Again, getting rid of the extraneous detail, just enough to tell the story and have a kid who's a center of interest and very curious kid, and will come even more curious as you'll see. Vivienne Mayer is another terrific female photographer. I happen to like a lot of female photographers, and she did wonderful street photography, a very strange woman in the sense that she shot thousands, tens of thousands of rolls of film and never developed them. And it was later that someone found suitcases full of this stuff and developed them. And we discovered that we had this wonderful street photographer who took all these images and didn't develop them. But very, very close, personal, wonderful images that she produced, well composed. The other thing that's really important in terms of composition is sometimes you get a really good composition because you shot a lot. You just don't, we talked about before, you just don't show up, take a picture and move on. So here's a Che Guevara picture you've probably seen, really famous. And here is this contact sheet for that shoot. And you can see there's lots of different images here that the photographer could have chose from, and he's highlighted a few of them. but there's lots to pick from, and there's one that in the left there that is the one that ended up being the iconic image. Now let's go back to this Diane Arbus picture, because it's really an interesting one, because if you actually look at the contact sheet for this series, you'll find it's just a goofy kid playing around. He's not, he looks like a very disturbed child in the first image, but as you can see here, he's just having fun, and he happens to have a toy grenade. And I had a toy grenade when I was a kid. Lots of kids did. And he's just having fun with it. So very interesting choices by Arbus in terms of composition, in terms of subject, in terms of how the subject is represented. Maybe if I was that kid and I was still alive today, and hopefully he is, I'd be pretty mad at Diane Arbus for depicting me the way she did, but that was the story she wanted to tell. So you also want to compose your images very carefully after you've thought about taking a lot of pictures and what you want to get in photographs and getting close. You want to compose. So this is a rectangle like you would fill with story. And you'll see these crosshairs represent the center of that photograph. And it's almost always the case, not always, but almost always the case, that that is the worst place to put a subject for your photograph. Better to take it off center a little bit in the lower quadrant or the upper quadrant, and here is an example of that. Here's a boring sunset. Here's a better, more dynamic sunset because it's moved off to the side. Here's a sunset that is, again, off to one of the upper thirds here. And you can use what's called the rule of thirds to divide up a scene and to put objects in it that, again, create some tension. It's not as dull as putting something right in the center. So the rule of thirds is you basically divide your rectangle horizontally and vertically, and place your subjects within those quadrants. You don't have to be doctrinaire about it, but it's a good idea in general. Here's a photograph I took just to demonstrate this in a sort of an exaggerated way, where the subject of interest, which is the Coke sign, is sitting on that third line, and the angle of the bicycle mirror here sort of maps out to the third lines as well. Here's another example where the point of interest is the tip of the canoe, and actually you've got some lines representing vectors that lead right to it, so your eye can't do anything but go to it, really. Here's another example where you've got a circle of interest right in the upper third there. It's kind of ridiculously obvious in this case. And you've got that blue line at the bottom that's sitting on the third line. Here's another example where you've got the Batman and the guy sitting reading off to from the center, and it makes a more interesting and compelling image. Here's another example. This is a portrait of a guy I took recently doing some welding, and again, on the third line, not in the center of the frame. You can also use the third when you're taking portraits of people, even if the head is in the center of the frame. You can do that, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Or you can move the head off to the side and a little smaller, and then you can sit the eye, in this case, right on the third line. So that's going to draw your attention to that eye and give the sense of dynamism to the image. So there he is on the third line. You can also do that with different kinds of portraits. Here's one where the nose is the third line and the black hat is along the upper third line. And if you break that into sort of modular sections or tonal clusters, you can see that that's even clearer here on the third line. Here's another example with a sort of landscape portrait. This is a bicycle activist in Toronto, and you can see that she's sitting right on the third line. Her nose is there and her eyes are right across that line. Here's another young woman, and again, she's sitting on the third line, area of interest right on that upper third. So, some basic ideas there. Keep your subjects away from the center and use the rule of thirds to create tension. It doesn't, again, you don't have to be doctrinaire, but it's a really good basic idea. I want to talk a little bit too about the geometry of choice. That's what I call it, in terms of thinking through geometrically the kind of images you want to create the most powerful image. So here's a young woman about to mount the stairs in Union Station, and there's the center of interest, but you'll notice that there are lines of interest, her purse, the railing, her iPhone cable there, leading right to her face and creating a really interesting dynamic between her and the vectors leading to her face. Here's another example. This is some workers in Toronto working at Union Station, and you can see that there are sort of 3 points of interest here and the lines of the girders running along the third lines there. And again, it produces a sense of dynamism there. Here's another example where we've got the sun coming off the right-hand side, and it's creating some interesting vectors here. And from a dynamic geometric point of view, creates some very interesting tension and ways that the eye can move around the subject or move around the scene without losing your sense of what you should be focusing on. So there are the points of interest there. I want to talk a little bit now about the geometry of seeing. Starting with a simple geometric shape, the line. And a line is very powerful because you can tell very simple stories with lines. This is all about texture and line. And it could be a story about the crash of an arrow that tried to fly too high to the sun. A radial is a variation on the theme of line. It's more complex. In this case, the sun is our friend because the sun creates natural radials. This is in Santa Fe, and the beams that represent the roof there also cast shadows, and the focal point is, again, on the third line. Rectangles can also be very powerful in terms of storytelling because they're rectangles within rectangles, really. And here's an air conditioner, and it's suggesting the 3 dimensions of the square or the rectangle because of the shadow that's being cast here. Circles are really powerful. This is, again, Union Station, very easy geometric shape to use for composition. Here's another example of it, sort of an ovoid shape there. Triangles can be your friend because they can direct attention, as we saw in the earlier photograph, and they can also represent 3-dimensional space in 2 dimensions. So here is a very solid image of a train track. Maybe a train's going to be coming soon. You've got an equilateral triangle representing the stability of that structure and representing the 3-dimensional parallax in a 2-dimensional shape. Arcs are a nice organic form of shape that you can work with, and you see them a lot in the real world. Here's a chair with a lot of arcs in behind as well, and other curves. Even the little sun logo down there has a curve to it. This is another curve. I like using organics on top of organics and curves on top of curves. So this is lots of curves in the background, and then the arc of that plinth or doorway there. An S-curve, again, is a variation a little more complex than the basic curve, and it shows up in nature, and you should certainly celebrate it in nature. When you have an opportunity to create a curve like this, do it. And it can show up in the real world, the world of men and women. And here's another example of an S-curve. So that's a little bit about composition. I hope that was helpful to you. In part 4, we're going to be talking about something a little more complex, lighting and exposure. So I hope you can stay tuned for that. And thank you very much for watching this part of Content in Hand, getting the best rich media from your mobile device. I'm Wayne McPhail. Thanks for watching.